Hello YouTube, today we're going to talk about disagreement, whether the fact of disagreement should affect our degree of confidence in our beliefs. So we disagree with other people all the time. Let's consider a few examples of disagreements. Suppose we are watching a horse race. We're both familiar with horse races and both equally well sighted. The ending is close, but I was attending very carefully and I think I see horse A win. However, I then discover that you were also attending very carefully and you think you saw horse B win. Now, in this case, it seems that once we're aware of the disagreement, it would be rational for us to suspend judgment. Given that we are both equally capable of visual perception and given that we were both watching the race very carefully, it seems that we both have equally good justification for our beliefs. But obviously we can't both be right. One of us must have made a mistake, and I have no reason to think that you were more likely to make a mistake than I was. So it seems that the rational thing for me to do is suspend judgment until the results are announced. Or let's suppose that we are at a restaurant and we want to figure out how to split the bill. I work it out to be £27 each. You work it out to be £28 each. Assume that we're both equally capable of arithmetic. We both did the addition very carefully. Neither of us is drunk or tired or otherwise incapacitated. Well, again, it looks like we should suspend judgment in this case. The fact that you worked it out to be £28, plus the fact that that we're both equally good at arithmetic and so on, gives me reason to doubt my own answer. And of course vice versa. The fact that I worked it out to be £27 gives you reason to doubt your answer. It seems it would be kind of irrational for either of us to insist dogmatically that, well, no, I have the right answer. We're both equally likely to have made a mistake. Now, disagreements like this are relatively easy to handle. We can resolve them by simply consulting a more authoritative source. With a horse race, we might have a slow motion finishing shot. With an arithmetic sum, we might use a calculator to work it out correctly. But what's interesting is that before we do this, before we consult the authoritative source, the mere fact of disagreement should lead us to suspend our judgment. Until we consult the authoritative source, we have to give up our own belief. I have to give up my belief that horse A was the winner of the race because you disagree with me. Now, the philosophically interesting cases are those where disagreement is persistent and there is no higher authority we can consult. And we can find examples of this in various areas of science, and philosophy, and politics, history, the arts, and so on. Within philosophy, consider the debate concerning moral realism. Are there objective moral facts? Are moral statements such as killing innocent people is wrong true? Do we discover moral facts like we discover that protons are made of quarks? Or is morality in some sense constructed by us? Is morality a matter of subjective personal opinion? Philosophers take very different positions on this question. This is a debate that has gone on for centuries, and it doesn't really seem to be close to any resolution. And we can't resolve the disagreement about moral realism by appealing to some higher authority. There just is no higher authority. Now, the important point here is that the parties to the disagreement are often epistemic peers. To say that somebody is an epistemic peer is to say that she is about as equally intelligent, equally well-informed about the relevant evidence, equally capable of working with the argument, equally free from bias as you are. And it seems clear that the majority of philosophical disputes occur between people who are basically epistemic peers. Equally capable philosophers disagree about the nature of moral value. And the same is true in other fields. In history, equally capable historians might disagree about why, for example, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. Equally capable paleontologists might disagree about the degree to which biodiversity has increased over the Phanerozoic era. Equally capable doctors might disagree about the right course of treatment for a patient. In many areas of life, epistemic peers come to radically different conclusions, and there's often no way to resolve the disagreement, at least in the short term, by finding an authoritative source. So we saw that disagreement in the case of the winner of the horse race, we saw that in that example the rational thing to do is to suspend judgment. And a big debate in epistemology is whether peer disagreement in general should lead us to suspend judgment about these more weighty matters like moral realism or why the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. Are we justified in retaining beliefs that are rejected by people who we recognise as epistemically equivalent to ourselves? Am I justified in remaining a moral anti-realist, given that there are people who are my epistemic peers who are moral realists? In fact, much of the time, notice that our disputants will not be epistemically equivalent, but actually epistemically better. So I'm not a moral realist. I think moral realism is pretty ridiculous, actually. But there are many people who I would have to admit are far better philosophers than I am, who accept moral realism. So obviously the worry about peer disagreement applies with even more force if the person you disagree with is not your peer, but is epistemically superior to you. I'm just noting that here, but for this video I'll focus specifically on peer disagreement. Now, broadly speaking, there are two views on this question. According to Conciliation, disagreement of epistemic peers should lead us to suspend judgment, to give up our beliefs and become agnostic on the issue, just like we would do in the horse race example. This has been defended by Richard Feldman, for example. According to steadfastness, disagreement of epistemic peers should not, in normal circumstances at any rate, cause us to lower our confidence in our beliefs. We should retain our beliefs in the face of peer disagreement. Thomas Kelly is a representative of this view. And notice that this is more of a spectrum than two clear camps, because we might hold views in between these two extremes. David Christensen holds that disagreement of epistemic peers should lead us to have much less confidence in our beliefs, but I don't think he would necessarily say that we should give up our beliefs entirely. So Christensen inclines strongly towards conciliation, but I'm not sure I don't think he says that peer disagreement should necessarily lead us to completely suspend judgment. So you can have more or less extreme versions of these two views. Now, an important thing to bear in mind here is that our question concerns mere disagreement. Obviously, if somebody proposes objections to your views, this might lead you to doubt your views because maybe the objections are really good. But what concerns us in this video is a case where you've thought long and hard about a topic and you've come to believe that P is true, and then you encounter somebody who you recognise as just as intelligent and well-informed as you are, and who's thought about P just as much as you, but who thinks that P is false. And we're putting aside the specific objections they have to P. Should the mere fact that they disagree with you, given that they're an epistemic peer, should that mere fact of disagreement make you more sceptical? Let's consider some arguments. One popular way to argue for conciliation is to appeal to intuitions about various everyday cases, and we've already done this. In the example of the horse race and the restaurant, it seems that the rational thing to do is to suspend judgment. But then the question is, what is the relevant difference between these everyday cases and a more weighty debate such as the moral realism debate? If disagreement should lead us to suspend judgment about the winner of the horse race, but not about the nature of moral value, then there must be some relevant difference between these two cases. So this argument, I've called it the no relevant difference argument, because it suggests that actually there just is no relevant difference between the horse race disagreement and more weighty disagreements. So either it's rational to be steadfast about who won the horse race, or it's rational to suspend beliefs about more weighty disagreements. But as we noted, it doesn't seem to be rational to be steadfast about the horse race. So we shouldn't be steadfast about more weighty disagreements either. So basically then, this thought is, when we reflect on these everyday cases, steadfastness just seems like unjustified stubbornness, just like pig-headedness. that there is not really any difference between the example of something like the horse race and moral realism debates. Now, of course, one obvious difference is that with the horse race, there is a more authoritative source that we can consult to decide the matter, such as the slow motion film. This isn't the case for the moral realism debate, but obviously it's not clear that this is a relevant difference. So imagine, suppose you watch the horse race and you come to a disagreement about it. So if it's rational to suspend judgment before consulting the slow motion film, then it seems we should also say that with moral realism, we should suspend judgment until an authority comes along. Maybe no such authority will ever emerge, but surely that just means that we'll have to suspend judgment indefinitely. So imagine if, when we try to check the slow motion film of the horse race, we find that it's been severely damaged and it no longer shows who won. And suppose also that when we ask other people who viewed the race, it's about a 50-50 split between people who think horse A won and people who think that horse B won. Well, in this case, surely we would just never know who won. It doesn't become rational to insist on horse A as the winner just because we no longer have an authority to consult. We're just going to have to suspend judgment permanently. So there is an obvious difference between the horse race and the moral realism debate insofar as usually there is an authority in the case of the horse race. But that's not, it seems to me, a relevant difference. So another response to this argument is we might try to find everyday cases where our intuitions go the other way. So one example that I gave at the beginning of this video was the restaurant example, where I work it out to be £27 and you work it out to be £28. And if I recognise that we're equally good at addition, it seems that I should suspend judgment. But now imagine this kind of case. Suppose that I check and recheck my addition, and I use a pen and a paper and a calculator, and I keep coming up with £27. Now you do the same, you keep coming up with £28, so the disagreement is a bit more persistent. Well, arguably in this case it seems more plausible for me to be steadfast. If I'm confident about my addition ability, and I've very carefully checked the sum a number of times, it seems like it would be rational for me to retain my beliefs and to assume that you're the one who's making the mistake. Now notice that arguably the weighty debates we find in philosophy and history and science are more like this kind of case than like the original restaurant case or like the horse race case. When a philosopher holds a position on moral realism, this is a result of carefully examining the arguments, checking and rechecking and then rechecking their reasoning and so on. So it's not clear then that the appeal to intuitions about everyday cases is going to decide the matter in favour of either conciliation or steadfastness, because depending on the case, we have different intuitions. In some cases, our intuitions tend to go towards conciliation. In some cases, we tend to be more steadfast. So perhaps this is just not a very useful way of trying to decide the matter. Okay, a second argument is the argument from symmetry. We're supposing that we are epistemic peers, and that I believe P while you believe that not P. Now, given that I consider you my peer, I must admit that antecedently there is nothing special about me that makes me more likely to be right than you are. Our positions are symmetrical. Consider the point of view of an unbiased third party who knows nothing about the debate. What they see is two people who are equally competent, equally trustworthy, who have access to the same evidence, but who disagree. Now, the third party would presumably suspend judgment. The third party wouldn't trust either one of the two disputants more than the other, so the fact that they disagree, again, we're assuming the third party doesn't have any stake in this debate, maybe they just haven't thought about it before. It seems like that third party should suspend judgment on the basis of about this debate. So the basic thought of this argument from symmetry is that I should remain committed to P only if I have some reason to privilege my views or my methods over those of the people who hold that not P. But, by hypothesis, we are considering a case of disagreement with peers, so I have no such reason to privilege my own views. Thomas Kelly, in his article The Epistemology of Disagreement, puts the problem quite nicely, and I quote, he says, "Wouldn't my failure to give equal weight to your judgment amount to a kind of epistemic arbitrariness on my part, an indefensible privileging of my own position, for no other reason than the fact that it is my own?" So, I mean, the question is, what could possibly justify sustaining confidence in your belief when you recognise that people who are epistemically equivalent to you don't share your conclusions? I admit that I'm just as likely to make mistakes as you are, so what justifies privileging my own opinions? And we can bolster this argument with the observation that when we recognise people as much more reliable than us, we tend to defer to them. We change our beliefs to be in line with theirs. Suppose I experience some medical issue, like headaches, for example, and doing a bit of research online, I come to believe that I have a brain tumour. When I go to the doctor, he tells me not to worry. It's really nothing. The headaches are just because of stress or whatever, or maybe I'm not eating properly or whatever. Now, it seems like rationally I should defer to the doctor. I mean, maybe I don't defer to the doctor because I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, so I'd probably still continue worrying about the tumour, but that's not the rational thing to do. Rationally, you should defer to the doctor. The doctor is the expert. We recognise certain people as experts on topics. These people are trustworthy, so that we should align our beliefs to what theirs are. Now, in this context then, disagreement causes us to adopt a different belief. So it does seem then that if we recognise somebody as equally reliable, then suspension of belief seems to fit. If we recognise somebody as being in a symmetrical position to us, then we should suspend our belief. So Thomas Kelly responds that the problem with this argument is that things are not perfectly symmetrical. Given the fact that I believe that P, while you believe that not P, this in itself gives me reason to think that you have made a mistake, that you have misjudged the force of the evidence. After all, people make mistakes all the time. Even very intelligent, very well-informed people make mistakes. I think Kelly's point is that by assuming perfect symmetry, the argument is question-begging. Anybody who's inclined towards steadfastness would take disagreement to indicate that their opponent has made an error, and hence is not in the same epistemic position. The very fact that we disagree breaks the symmetry between us, because I now have reason to believe that you have made an error. So really, the argument from symmetry is a statement of conciliation rather than an argument for it. I'm not really sure how persuasive this response is. David Christensen responds to Kelly's objection. Christensen says that the real point of the argument from symmetry is that if I grant that you are an epistemic peer, then it's true that disagreement gives me reason to think that you have made a mistake, but it also gives me reason, just as good a reason, to think that I have made a mistake. The fact that you disagree with me gives me evidence that I am in error, that I've made a mistake. And of course, it's the same is true for you, that the fact that we disagree gives you evidence that you have made a mistake. So the symmetry still holds in the relevant respects. Now, of course, given disagreement, obviously there must be some sort of asymmetry, because if everything was equal, then we'd hold the same belief. The question is, why should we assume that the asymmetry favours yourself? If I see you as an epistemic peer, there's just no reason to think that I'm in the stronger position, that it was you who made the mistake rather than me. Christensen illustrates this with the example of a watch. Suppose I have a trusty watch that I always make sure is up to date. It says that the time is 4:10. You also have a trusty watch, and I know that you take equally good care of it. Your watch says it's 4:20. Well, I now have evidence that your watch is fast. But surely I also have evidence. I have evidence that's just as strong that my watch is slow. My watch is 10 minutes too slow. So that's the respect in which our positions are symmetrical, and that's why we should suspend belief. according to Christensen. A similar argument appeals to the nature of evidence. Notice that to say that somebody is an epistemic peer is to say that they tend to respond to evidence appropriately, they tend to come to accurate conclusions. I mean, I assume that you would say that you yourself come to accurate conclusions, right? So I think that I tend to come to accurate conclusions. So if I recognise somebody as an epistemic peer, then they must tend to come to accurate conclusions as well. They tend to respond to the evidence appropriately. Certainly, an epistemic peer couldn't be substantially less reliable at reasoning than you are. By definition, an epistemic peer is basically about as good at reasoning as you are. So the fact that an epistemic peer believes that P, on the basis of some evidence E, is itself evidence that it is reasonable to believe P on the basis of E. The point here is that the judgments of other people are not really any different from any other kind of evidence. So think about the litmus paper turning red, right? When litmus paper turns red, that's evidence that the substance is an acid. And this is going to be because the litmus paper turning red reliably indicates that the substance is an acid. In other words, when the litmus paper turns red, most of the time that's because there's an acid there. It could be caused by other things. I mean, maybe you've put a dye in the water or something that dyes the paper, but most of the time, assuming you haven't done things like dye the water, when the litmus paper turns red, it's because it's been put into acid. So if I treat you as a reliable believer, then the fact that you believe that P reliably indicates that P is true. It's just the same as when the litmus paper turning red reliably indicates an acid. If you tend to come to accurate conclusions, the fact that you believe P reliably indicates that P is true. And there's nothing unusual about treating people this way. The weather forecaster correctly predicts the weather 80% of the time, so when he says it will rain tomorrow, that's evidence that it will rain tomorrow. Or if I ask you where our friend John is, and you say he's gone to the beach, your belief that he's gone to the beach is evidence that he has in fact gone to the beach, because I know that you tend to come to accurate beliefs. Now there are a couple of problems with this argument as an argument for conciliation. First of all, the point of the argument is that both psychological states and non-psychological states can count as evidence. That seems to be the idea here. The point of this argument seems to be trying to draw an analogy between a non-psychological state, like litmus paper turning red, and a psychological state, like a person's belief. But then we got a bit of a problem, because I may possess a great deal of non-psychological evidence that P is false. So I'm confident that P is false. However, I also possess the psychological evidence that some peer thinks that P is true. Now, the problem is that it seems that this argument requires me to give no weight to the non-psychological evidence, and all the weight to the psychological evidence. And how can this be justified? So let's say we're debating phyletic gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. These are two different theories of patterns of macroevolutionary change. And suppose that I'm against punctuated equilibrium. I think that basically all the evidence disconfirms it. Punctuated equilibrium is contradicted by fossil evidence, by experimental laboratory studies, by theoretical arguments, and so on. Now, on the other side, I have to put the fact that some epistemic peers disagree with me. Some people think punctuated equilibrium is true. Now, according to this argument about the nature of evidence, the mere fact that some people disagree with me, that alone outweighs everything that I might put in the column against punctuated equilibrium. So it seems like we're treating psychological evidence as a kind of trump card that just outweighs all other kinds of evidence. I mean, if we're saying that the psychological evidence that some peer believes that punctuated equilibrium is true outweighs all the evidence against punctuated equilibrium, then we appear to be treating the psychological evidence as a trump card, as something that renders all of this other evidence unpersuasive. But that seems very strange. That seems far too extreme. Now, I suppose one of the things we might say in response, the defender of this argument might say in response, is that one of the things in question is whether the non-psychological evidence confirms or contradicts punctuated equilibrium, right? So your peer, my peer, presumably thinks that most of the non-psychological evidence actually confirms punctuated equilibrium, and that's why they think that punctuated equilibrium is true, because they've evaluated the non-psychological evidence and they think it favours punctuated equilibrium. So since I recognise my peer as somebody who tends to form accurate beliefs, the fact that they believe that the non-psychological evidence favours punctuated equilibrium is itself evidence that the non-psychological evidence does indeed favour punctuated equilibrium. So it's not so much that the psychological evidence of their belief outweighs all the non-psychological evidence. The question is whether the non-psychological evidence really does show that punctuated equilibrium is false. Maybe it shows that it's true. Okay, a second objection to this argument. Suppose I am deliberating some proposition P, I enumerate the evidence in favour of it and the evidence against it. Now, according to this argument for conciliation from the nature of evidence, included in the evidence in favour of P is the fact that my epistemic peer Frank believes that P. But now suppose that Frank lists the reasons he believes that P. Well, presumably, he would not include in that list the fact that he himself believes that P. Right? Frank's believing that P is not, for Frank, an additional reason to believe that P. So, we both have access to the same fact. We both know that Frank believes that P. Now, according to the evidence argument, this counts as evidence of P for me. But it doesn't count as evidence of P for Frank. Now, this seems like a kind of strange conclusion. I think we'll discuss this problem a little more next time, but the point for now is just that beliefs don't work as evidence in quite the same way that non-psychological facts like litmus paper does. And that might lead us to worry about arguing for conciliation by trying to draw analogies between psychological and non-psychological evidence. If we're asking whether or not a substance is an acid, well, if the litmus paper turns red, that's evidence that it's an acid, period. It doesn't matter whether you're me or Frank or whoever else. But in this case, when it comes to beliefs, if we say that Frank's belief that P is evidence for P, then we're going to run into these problematic cases, or at least these rather strange cases. Presumably, we wouldn't want to say that Frank's belief that P is evidence of P from Frank's perspective. So, that's all for today. We'll talk a bit more about conciliation and steadfastness whenever I do the next video. Goodbye.